The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Robert MacNeil comes into millions of American homes each weeknight as co-anchor of public TV's MacNeil Lehrer News Hour. He's also known for his nonfiction writings, which include a book on the relationship between politics and television, and his memoirs Word Struck and The Right Place at the Right Time. Now MacNeil has tried his hand as a novelist. His first major work of fiction, The Burden of Desire. It's a book about war and faith and sensuality set in Halifax, Nova Scotia during World War I. And welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
What made you choose this particular period in time as the setting for your first novel?
Well, I think it was, the town is where I grew up, and in the Second World War. And the idea came while I was writing Word Struck, which was about my childhood in that war. And just suddenly one day, I think because I'd thinking about my mother in the Second World War and her friends, who were all still quite young women, and were alone for essentially 5 years, with children, some of them not. And I think without knowing anything explicit, because children don't, I must have intuited some emotional coloring from it, because the idea came to me, and I remember going out to my wife and saying, wouldn't it be interesting to write a book about a woman who was alone in this town in the First World War, when everything was even more constricted and restricted than it was, certainly than it is now, and than it was 20 or 30 years later. Also, I was born in 1931, so the first 8 years of my life were in the shadow of the First World War, the Second World War beginning for Canada in '39, and it was the mythic war in our family. The Second World War, the 5 years of that for Canada, were the years from which I was 8 to 13, and children, anything they live through every day, it's mundane to them. And that's that sort of banality of everyday life. So I didn't think of the Second World War. My father, who was away for most of it, didn't parade any military heroics or anything. And then the reading I did in late high school and in college was all books written by people whose, certainly fiction, whose sensibility was created by the awful conditions of the First World War. So it was very congenial to me, the First World War.
You also use a real life event as the moment, a sort of catalyst for a lot of things to happen in this novel, and it's something you heard a lot of stories about as you were growing up.
Yeah. On December 6th, 1917, third year of the war for Canada, first year of the war for the United States, a ship loaded with munitions in New York on its way to France went up the coast of New England and into Halifax to join a convoy to go to Europe. In the harbor, it was in collision with another ship, and it blew up. And it made the largest man-made explosion before Hiroshima. In fact, Robert Oppenheimer studied the Halifax explosion in trying to calculate what the effect would be of the equivalent of a certain tonnage of high explosives in nuclear explosive. It killed nearly 2,000 people. The exact number is still a little uncertain. 2,000 people out of a town of 55,000.
It just flattened a particular section of the city.
And it flattened a huge area of the city, largely poor working class area. And then 24 hours later, while they were still trying to dig bodies out and living people out of the wreckage, there was a blizzard which dumped 30 inches of snow on it. Anyway, I heard about all this throughout my childhood. My mother was a child of 10 in it, wasn't injured. My grandfather was one of those who the night afterwards got a sleigh and a horse and collected blankets and clothing to take to the homeless, and that's where I got the idea for one of my characters who does that in the book.
And then that's a young Anglican clergyman by the name of Peter Wentworth, who becomes obsessed when he finds a diary kept by a young woman whose husband is away in the war, a woman named Julia Robertson. But he's only one of two men who become obsessed with her.
That's right. Well, he represents, although it wasn't sort of set up this way, he, in the end, represents the rather conservative and established attitudes of the time. And he's what we would call today rather uptight about everything. And he's in an unhappy marriage, and he's uncertain about his own faith. And he's also very embarrassed that his requests to go to the war as a military chaplain have been refused. And so he feels guilty about that too.
I was surprised in reading the book that the men who didn't go, who stayed behind in the war for whatever reason, were often humiliated in public by women.
Yeah, by women, because all the propaganda machinery played on women to try and shame their men to go, especially by the third year of the war, when the brave, adventurous spirit that had all the young men leaping off when it opened, fearful that it would be over before they got there. This was going to be, you know, the great adventure. By the third year of the war, they'd had to introduce conscription, which was very unpopular, and even very respectable families were doing their best to hide their young sons, you know, sending them off to summer cottages and things like that to get them out of the way, or sending them off to friends on farms and so on. But yes, the propagandists were playing. They would hold rallies of women, and they'd bring soldiers back from the front, and only women would be invited, and these soldiers would get up and prey on these women to plead with them to send reinforcements for the brave men at the front.
And
but
when women saw men on the street, they would hand them a white feather.
A white feather, yeah. It was a symbol of cowardice. It was quite common during the First World War. I don't know whether it happened in the States, perhaps because it was only a year or so in the war, and it was different. But certainly it also happened in Britain.
Now, Julia Robertson, the young woman who keeps the diary that ends up in the pocket of a coat that's collected in the clothing drive.
You've read the book very carefully.
I have read the book. She writes about her feelings about her husband, about the feelings she has about not having any kind of intimacy during this period. And this diary not only attracts this young clergyman, Peter Wentworth, but also a man who's more reflective of the push and pull of the times, Stuart McPherson.
Yes, he's a childhood friend of the clergyman's, but he's gone a very different route, and he's a very different person, and he has studied psychology.
Freudian psychology
with a disciple of Freud's, Ernest Jones, who later went on to be a biographer of Freud, who taught at the University of Toronto for several years. And if he, of course, reads the diary, may I say, there's nothing really, to my mind, lurid. There's nothing X-rated about the diary. It is what we would consider, I think, not unusual sentiments for a young woman to have today, in acknowledging her own sexuality and erotic fantasies.
But in the time, quite different.
I don't think that people are different in different times. I think they appear to be different in history, partly because of the clothing they wear, which is a sort of symbolic, especially for women, of the constriction of their lives, which society imposes at different times, and then releases again at other times. For instance, if you look back to the Empire period at the beginning of the 19th century, women wore extremely revealing clothing and very flimsy clothing. By the reaction that came in during Victorian times, their bodies were covered up completely, and they were wearing corsets which constricted them in a symbolic way.
And that's what poor Julia Robertson was
which
stuck
Betty
in.
Friedan and others were still campaigning against by the 1960s. So it isn't that there's anything we would consider terribly unusual in the diary. What's unusual is the frankness of it on paper, because she has no other way of confiding her thoughts. And so it is seen by the clergyman as he's never seen anything as explicit as this, and he was brought up to believe that nice women didn't think this way. The young psychologist, of course, takes it as he reads it, he's so used to reading abnormal feminine psychology that he reads this almost as a sort of dissertation on normalcy.
Well, to the clergyman, she becomes a kind of sexual goddess, but to the psychologist, she becomes the embodiment of what he thinks of as the modern woman.
Yes, it does, because he's had a very fairly extensive and normal sexual life for an unattached man up to that time. And so he is able, he's free enough in his own psyche to concentrate on her other attributes, the fact that she's a very intelligent and interesting and concerned young woman, and whereas the clergyman sees only, really only her sexuality. So
it was a wonderful point in history. There were so many things pulling at each
Yeah.
other. I mean, on the one hand, the Impressionists and the composers like Stravinsky and Freudian psychology, and on the other hand, this very, as you say, constricted and restrictive philosophy and way of life.
I think it would have been equally true of any small city, and probably big cities in this country, as it was in that small seaport then. It was at the dawn of the modern era. Most of the new ideas, the explosive new ideas, which were going to create the intellectual climate we know today, we find familiar today, and you've mentioned some of them, had already burst on the scene in Europe well before the First World War. But I was interested to see how they might have penetrated a small society like this. And Julia Robertson is an instrument of that because she has studied painting in Paris. And she actually studied with one of Canada's great painters, Jim Maurice, who was a personal friend of Matisse. In fact, when Matisse went off to Tangier in those 2 summers and painted those 2 winters and painted all those famous paintings, this guy Maurice was with him. Anyway, I have her in my freedom as a fiction writer, studying with him, but going and with his help and very cheaply buying a Matisse, and she actually has a Matisse.
And hangs it in the living room at one point.
Because her husband doesn't like it, but after his being gone for 2 years, she says to herself, well, what's the point of hiding it if he isn't here? Whether he likes it or not, I'm going to hang it up. And
this book is a great yarn. It's a wonderful read, and I guess one of the things people always say about novelists is that somewhere in the book is the novelist himself or herself. So where in Burden of Desire is Robert MacNeil?
I think maybe nowhere and yet everywhere, all over the place. There are echoes of feelings and little bits of things that I recognize in myself. My sister-in-law, my next brother's wife, is a sculptress, and very good portrait heads that really show the psychology of the person as well as just the physical appearance. And we were discussing this, because she knows me very well, in Halifax when we launched the book a couple of weeks ago. And she said, I think probably you do what I do in my sculpture. You recognize in others what you understand in yourself, which I think is a very good phrase. So I can't explicitly point to any of the things in the book and say that's me, but if you make it, if you create the characters, obviously a lot of it's got to be you. Not in a literal way, but in a I don't know, abstracted way.
Much of the book is taken up with the personal writings of this young woman, Julia Robertson. How did you prepare yourself as a writer to step into that character, to become the mind of this young woman?
It wasn't any prepared exercise, except to research the period a bit. I went back and because I wanted her diary to do several things. Obviously, to put herself on paper, but I wanted it also to her, because she comes from another city, Montreal, through her eyes to get a portrait of that society in Halifax. And also through her eyes to give a chronology of the war years and certain incidents and things that had happened. So to produce that, I went back and on microfilm went over all the morning newspapers of that city for the 3 years and researched that way. But as for her voice just came to me, and I don't know exactly where it comes from. It comes from all sorts of things. I had a great-grandmother who kept a diary during the Civil War, and I have that. And while she would never, in 1860s, have been explicit about that side of her, the erotic side of her life, she was a very free-spirited and strong-minded young woman. And she was, there may be something of that. But I think it's all kinds of things. I was given when I was very young, 19, and my father, who was, like many people, a bit embarrassed about anything to do with sex education or anything, but very widely read and always giving me books to read. He gave me James Joyce's Ulysses and said, you should read Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end, the last 40 pages of Ulysses. He said, you won't find anything franker than that. Well, I did, and at 19 it made a great impression on me. Well, my diary is mild by comparison with Molly Bloom's Reveries, but I think there are a lot of sources, and just I'm a trained observer. As a reporter, I listen and talk to people.
I wondered if anyone has said to you since reading this book, gee, this is not a Robert MacNeil that I know. This has taken me by surprise. And I read once, for example, you said about your co-anchor, Jim Lehrer, that no one's surprised on the program when he has tears in his eyes about a story, but when you get emotional, people tend to think that you might be getting sick, and that this is a little bit different.
Well, I have that kind of wooden persona, I think, on television. And but
Canadian Reserve, I think.
Yeah, Canadian Reserve. Yeah.
But you don't. Has anybody been?
It's a good title for
your next novel.
Good name for a rye whiskey, actually, Canadian Reserve.
But has anybody said this is a side of you I never saw before?
Oh, sure. Lots of people have, because I think there's an incongruity in the subject matter in the way I'm perceived on television. But I set out to be a fiction writer long before I became a journalist. Well, several years before. And became a journalist really only because I had to earn a living. And then the journalism got pretty interesting. But over the years I've been trying to write novels. I've had about 6 or 7 stabs at it.
Was there any impetus for taking the novel on? But again, from your co-host Jim Lehrer, you told a wonderful story about him where you said, Jim Lehrer writes novels like Hens Lay Eggs.
Right.
You wake up in the morning, reach under
him,
and there's another one.
Warm no. Yeah, right. Well, he's been doing for 5 years now. He's been doing one a year and writing plays. And sure, I think there's a little healthy competition between us on that. But we discuss it all the time, and we give each other our manuscripts to read and ask for suggestions. He had a major suggestion on this one when I gave him the first draft of the manuscript, which was a lot longer than this. I had the diary out beginning the book, trying to set the scene with the diary, and he said, no, it really should go inside the book.
What does writing this novel give you in terms of your own sense of your work and your personal satisfaction that the other parts of your life haven't?
I don't know. It's just something I've always wanted to do, to write fiction. I tried plays, I tried novels, and so it gives me a lot of satisfaction to see that I can do it, finally. I think a lot of the impetus was that when I began this, I was approaching my 60th birthday. And while none of the other decade birthdays had meant anything very much to me, obviously the prospect of being 60 in some way was getting at me, but it gave me an enormous kick to do this. And I was saying to myself, and I said literally to an editor, if I don't do it now, I'm never going to do it. Damn it, I'm going to do it. And so I think that was part of the impetus.
Getting back to your day job for a minute, the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour, I read that when you came up with this idea in the mid-1970s, early 1970s, it was kind of an uphill battle to sell this idea of the quieter, less kinetic or frenetic kind of news program.
It wasn't to the people who asked me to start it, and then with Jim to start it in 1975, the station in New York where it began, and we were invited to start something different and do it the way we thought it should be done. So there was no difficulty with them. There was no difficulty immediately with the public broadcasting system, who put it on late at night on the satellite in a bit of what was then empty time in case stations wanted to pick it up. And as it turned out, they did. And then it became established on the system. It was with people in friends in commercial television who said, gee, that's a crazy idea. I mean, I can remember a few weeks before we started, a well-known producer at one of the networks saying to me over lunch, well, you can't do that. That's like doing an instant special every night. And others saying, before I left the BBC in England to come back and start it, my friends at the BBC, who were very skilled producers and producers of very thoughtful television, said, oh, yeah, that sounds a bit boring to me. So, but I think it works now in the American context because there was nothing else like it at the time, and it became a real alternative. And all we were concerned to do, really, was to demonstrate that in one corner of this wonderful medium, there should be a place where you could show a different way of doing the news.
What do you think the show's successes have been?
Demonstrating that you can do news in an alternative way on television, and therefore expanding the range of television journalism. It's like the map of the known world of television news. We've drawn another little bump on it. It's helped to rehabilitate the talking head in the news context, because when we came along, there was very little live talking head, except on the Sunday interview shows. And now there's a great deal more, including on the morning shows on the networks. And Nightline was born after we'd been on for a couple of years, and I know what we were doing influenced ABC because I was talking to Roone Arledge a lot about it. And I think the Sunday shows have changed their format as a result of the success of Nightline and some of these. So the talking head, which to me is still the most, if it's the right head saying the right thing, is still basic to human communication. The fact that the television industry would have despised it is absurd, because the human head is the one thing that in real life size perfectly fits the television frame. Everything else in the human body is either diminished or exaggerated by it, but this just absolutely fits, you know, and therefore it has that compulsion that things that are the right size have on human understanding, human emotions, I think.
What about the show's shortcomings?
Well, I don't think it has any. Well, you can't, if you're going to depend on discussions of serious issues, and we usually do at least one of those every night, you're going to have nights when the issues aren't very compelling, or where you get guests who aren't electrifying, or where we don't ask as good or penetrating questions as we should, and where the energy factor, which is so much a part of any performance, whether it's writing or acting or music or anything else, there has to be a certain tension and energy to it to hold people's attention, and where it may flag. We feel it our responsibility to do, like the program last night, did a discussion about the referendum today in South Africa, which is really crucial. We did a discussion on it with 3 people in the United States in a film set up in South Africa. Now, not everybody in this country, even regular watchers of our show, may be fascinated to go through 25 minutes on South Africa. For those who do, it's there. So those who don't want it that night would think, oh, gee, why are they doing South Africa? Well, I'll tune in later. So you can't guarantee high electricity television 56 or 57 minutes every hour, 5 nights a week.
You've often showed probably what people would consider to be a healthy skepticism about the medium that you work in. And you told a great story in The Right Place at the Right Time about trying to get Charlie Chaplin for an interview.
Yeah, he was getting an honorary degree at Oxford. And I was working for NBC then in London. And Charlie Chaplin had never permitted himself to be interviewed on television. He had never appeared on television. He so hated the United States because of the way he felt he was treated by Hollywood that he'd exiled himself to Europe and had nothing to do with the television medium. And I got in touch with the master of the college at Oxford where he was staying and said, could we come and do an interview? And he said, oh yes, not having consulted Chaplin. So we set up in his garden. And the next morning, Chaplin came bounding out, and the camera was there, and he heard that he was to be interviewed, and he came out, and when he saw the camera, he said, oh, but not with the camera. And then for the next nearly 3 hours, he played a game with us of my trying to persuade him, while he, in the most wonderful display of the whole range of all his talents, acted out, sometimes impersonating characters back here, and with all the winsomeness of Charlie Chaplin and the coyness and the seductiveness and everything else. He kept telling me why he couldn't do it, finally promising me that when his memoirs came out, I could come to Switzerland and do an interview with him. But what we got in that 3 hours was 3 hours of Charlie Chaplin, just watching him there. He didn't have anywhere else to go. He wasn't being picked up until lunchtime. He told fabulous stories. As I say, he personally performed all the little attitudes and parts and things he was talking about, and he never agreed to the interview. I was tempted all the time to turn the camera on without him knowing, but as he promised we'd get an interview later, I thought that would be dumb to try and cheat it like that. But it was an incredible morning, and of course an incredible loss.
Well, he's one of the things that he said was that he didn't like doing television because most often the interview ended up being about the interviewer instead of the interviewee.
Yes,
and in your book you agreed.
Well, yes, I do. And he said television was too cruel, he thought. But I don't know whether television would have been good for his talents, and certainly he didn't need a television interview on an American network to enhance his reputation.
We only have about a minute left, and I wanted to ask you a question that really deserves a lot longer time than that, but you're one of the journalists who come out of a tradition of working in print. You began with Reuters, and you've worked in television for many years. Mm-hmm. There's a generation of television journalists now where that's really their home medium. That's where they began. Do you think the journalism is different because of that difference in experience?
Yeah, I think it's different because it relies less on the word, or the disciplines are less expressed through the word and more expressed with picture and speech. But it really depends in seriousness on what kind of training and what kind of disciplines were imposed in that training in terms of accuracy and fairness and basically those fundamental things. And they can be just as seriously performed in the visual medium as they can in print, not as extensively or not as in as much depth. But I don't think it means it necessarily has to be more frivolous. But if you're someone who bypasses all the disciplines and quickly becomes very well known because you're a very handsome person or a very pretty person and doesn't need the disciplines and the skills that normally go with the craftsmanship, that I worry about.
And sometimes people worry about the medium's demand on the prettiness and the handsomeness as opposed to
I've never had to worry about that
potatoes.
myself.
Robert MacNeil, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on the program. Again, Robert MacNeil's first novel, Burden of Desire.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.